Well, this is 2009, and it's the bicentenary of Charles Darwin, and all over the world, eminent evolutionists are anxious to celebrate this. And what they're planning to do is to enlighten us on almost every aspect of Darwin and his life and how he changed our thinking. I say almost every aspect because there's one aspect of this story which they have thrown no light on, and they seem anxious to skirt around it and step over it and talk about something else. So I'm going to talk about it. It's the question of why are we so different from the chimpanzees? We get the genetics keeping on telling us how extremely closely we are, hardly any genes of difference, very, very closely related. And yet, when you look at the phenotypes, there's a chimp, there's a man. It's astoundingly different, no resemblance at all. I'm not talking about airy-fairy stuff about culture or psychology or behavior. I'm talking about ground-based, nitty-gritty, measurable physical differences. That one is hairy and walking on four legs. That one is a naked biped. Why? I mean, then if I'm a good Darwinist, I've got to believe there's a reason for that. If we change so much, something must have happened. What happened? Now, 50 years ago, that was a laughably simple question. Everybody knew the answer. They knew what happened. The ancestors to the apes stayed in the trees. Our ancestors went out onto the plain. That explained everything. We had to get up on our legs to peer over the tall grass or to chase after animals or to free our hands for weapons. And we had got so overheated in the chase that we had to take off that fur coat and throw it away. Everybody knew that for generations. But then, in the 90s, something began to unravel. The paleontologists themselves looked a bit more closely at the accompanying microfauna that lived in the same time and place as the hominids. And they weren't savanna species. And they looked at the herbivores, and they weren't savanna herbivores. And then they were so clever, they found a way to analyze fossilized pollen. Shock horror. The fossilized pollen was not of savanna vegetation. Some of it even came from lianas, those things that dangle in the middle of the jungle. So we're left with a situation where we know that our earliest ancestors were running around on four legs in the trees before the savanna ecosystem even came into existence. This is not something I've made up. It's not a minority theory. Everybody agrees with it. Professor Tobias came over from South Africa and spoke to University College London. He said, everything I've been telling you for the last 20 years, forget about it. It was wrong. We've got to go back to square one and start again. It made him very unpopular. They didn't want to go back to square one. I mean, it's a terrible thing to happen. You've got this beautiful paradigm. You've believed in it from generations. Nobody has questioned it. You've been constructing fanciful things on top of it, relying on it to be as solid as a rock, and now it's whipped away from under you. What do you do? What does a scientist do in that case? Well, we know the answer because Thomas S. Schoon wrote a seminal treatise about this back in 1962. He said, what scientists do when a paradigm fails is, guess what? They carry on as if nothing had ever happened. If they haven't got a paradigm, they can't ask the question. So they say, yes, it's wrong, but supposing it was right. And the only other option open to them is to stop asking the questions. So that is what they have done now. That's why you don't hear them talking about it, yesterday's question. Some of them have even elevated it into a principle, what we ought to be doing. Aaron Filler from Harvard says, isn't it time we stop talking about selective pressures? I mean, why don't we talk about, look, there's chromosomes and there's genes, and recall what we see? Charles Darwin must be spinning in his grave. He knew all about that kind of science, and he called it hypothesis-free science, and he despised it from the bottom of his heart. And if you're going to say, I'm going to stop talking about selective pressures, you can take the origin species and throw it out of the window, because it's about nothing else but selective pressures. And the irony of it is that this was one occasion of a paradigm collapse where they didn't have to wait for a new paradigm to come up. There was one waiting in the wings. It had been waiting there since 1960, when Alistair Hardy, a marine biologist, said, I think what happened, perhaps our ancestors had a more aquatic existence for some of the time. He kept it to himself for 30 years, but then the press got hold of it and all hell broke loose. All his colleagues said, this is outrageous, you've exposed us to public ridicule. You must never do that again. And at that time, it became set in stone. The aquatic theory should be dumped with the UFOs and the Yetis as part of the lunatic fringe of science.